Picture this. You're holding something small, unassuming, almost humble, a palm-sized piece of clay, hardened by time, bearing the faint impressions of symbols carved thousands of years ago. It doesn't look like much at first glance, but this little fragment contains echoes of voices from a world long gone. These ancient clay tablets are far more than dried mud. They are time capsules, preserving the thoughts, trades, dreams, and laws of people who walked the earth millennia before us. When you look closely, you begin to sense the weight of history in your hands, the receipts of merchants, the prayers of priests, the letters of kings, all waiting patiently through centuries for their stories to be heard again. What if I told you that these unassuming pieces of clay could completely reshape what we know about human history? For generations, many of us imagined ancient civilizations as isolated worlds, each developing in its own bubble. But these tablets tell a different story. They reveal a vibrant, interconnected web of exchange that stretched across continents, linking cultures through trade, ideas, and innovation long before the internet, before planes, before globalization became a modern concept. These artifacts are proof that humanity has always been curious, always reaching, always building bridges not just of stone, but of knowledge and mutual understanding. In this video, we're going to journey together into the heart of this lost world, guided by the very clay that recorded it. We'll see how a receipt for lapis lazuli from Afghanistan ended up in Mesopotamia, how love poetry from Sumer inspired hymns in Egypt, and how legal codes from Babylon influenced justice systems from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. We'll meet the decipherers who cracked codes thought unbreakable and explore how these ancient networks challenge everything we thought we knew about isolation, progress, and what it means to be connected. So settle in. What you're about to discover might just change how you see our shared past and perhaps our future as well. Long before paper, before scrolls, before digital bytes, there was clay. In the fertile crescent of ancient Mesopotamia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, one of humanity's most transformative inventions was born not from gold or stone, but from the mud beneath our feet. Around 3400 BCE, the earliest known clay tablets began to appear, and they did not emerge as grand works of art or profound philosophical texts. Their purpose was beautifully, fundamentally practical. Imagine the bustling city of Uruk, a hive of activity where temple administrators faced a problem we can all relate to. There was simply too much to remember. The flow of goods, barley, wool, livestock was overwhelming. Who had paid their taxes? How much grain was in the storehouses? It was this administrative necessity, the sheer pressure of an expanding economy, that sparked the creation of writing. A scribe would take a lump of wet river clay, form it into a portable rectangular tablet, and using a sharpened reed stylus, he would press a series of wedge-shaped marks into its surface. This system of writing, which we now call cuneiform, began as straightforward pictographs, simple drawings that gradually evolved into a more abstract and efficient script. This wasn't about recording poetry or history yet. It was about creating a permanent receipt, an immutable contract, an inventory list that could be stored and referenced. The genius of their choice of material cannot be overstated. Clay was everywhere abundant, cheap, and incredibly easy to use while moist. But once it was sun-dried or, for truly important documents, fired in a kiln, it became practically indestructible. While papyrus could rot, parchment could burn, and digital data can corrupt, a fired clay tablet could survive a building collapse, a fire, or millennia buried in the desert sand. This durability is the single greatest reason we have this window into the ancient world today. Archaeologists emphasize that the physicality of clay actively shaped how knowledge was managed. You couldn't scroll through it, you held a complete, finite document in your hand. Tablets could be stored on shelves, organized in archives, and even placed in clay envelopes for security, creating the world's first filing cabinets. This ability to preserve information accurately across generations was nothing short of revolutionary. It allowed for the centralization of power and the management of complex, far-flung empires. Laws could be standardized and disseminated, resources could be allocated with precision, and trade agreements could be recorded with a permanence that fostered trust over vast distances. This foundational practice of inscribing information in clay did more than just keep accounts. It built the very backbone of administrative civilization. It provided the stability and organization necessary for societies to grow beyond simple village life into sprawling, interconnected networks of cities and states, setting the stage for everything that was to follow. But these silent tablets, though perfectly preserved, were useless without a key. For centuries, the intricate scripts carved into their surfaces were nothing more than mysterious patterns, a locked door to the past with no obvious way in. The journey to crack these ancient codes is a tale of intellectual heroism, one that transformed our understanding of human history. Take cuneiform, for instance. By the 19th century, European travelers were bringing back clay tablets from the Middle East, utterly baffled by the thousands of tiny wedge-shaped marks. The script was so foreign that some early scholars didn't even know which way to hold the tablets. The breakthrough came from an unlikely figure, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson, who was stationed in Persia. There, high on a cliff face at Behistun, was a massive trilingual inscription carved by order of King Darius the Great. It told the same story in 3 different cuneiform scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Rawlinson risked his life repeatedly, dangling from ropes to meticulously copy the strange characters. His work was like having the same message in 3 unknown languages, and he used the Old Persian section, which had recognizable names of kings, as his initial Rosetta Stone. Through decades of painstaking comparison and brilliant deduction, he and a community of scholars across Europe began to unravel the puzzle. They realized that cuneiform wasn't just a simple alphabet. It was an incredibly complex system where a single symbol could represent a whole word, a syllable, or even just a sound, depending on the context. This wasn't mere picture writing. It was a sophisticated, flexible tool for recording everything from epic poetry to the price of a bushel of barley. This same story of daunting challenge and brilliant triumph played out again millennia later, and a world away with Linear B, discovered on clay tablets at Knossos on Crete and later at Pylos on the Greek mainland. This script was entirely unlike the familiar Greek alphabet of later centuries. For over 50 years, the finest minds in archaeology and linguistics tried and failed to decipher it. The prevailing theory was that it wrote an unknown Minoan language, perhaps unrelated to any other. Enter Michael Ventris, an English architect who was obsessed with the puzzle since he was a schoolboy. He approached it not as a dusty academic exercise, but as a massive structural problem, a code waiting to be broken. Ventris employed a methodical, almost mathematical approach, creating vast grids to categorize the symbols and their frequencies. He noticed that certain groups of signs appeared repeatedly in similar positions, likely representing place names on the administrative records found in the palaces. He made a breathtaking leap of intuition, guessing that these recurring words might be ancient Cretan cities like Amnisos and Knossos itself. When he tentatively assigned sound values to the symbols based on these guesses, something miraculous happened. The tablets began to reveal not a strange, lost language, but a very early form of Greek. This was a seismic shock to the academic world. It proved that Greek-speaking Mycenaeans had ruled over Knossos centuries earlier than previously believed, completely rewriting the history of the Aegean Bronze Age. The content of the tablets was, at first glance, mundane lists of chariot wheels, quantities of cloth, and offerings to the gods. But within that mundanity lay a revelation. These were the meticulous inventory records of a complex, centralized palace economy, a world already advanced and interconnected through trade and administration. The decipherment of these scripts did more than just translate words. It opened a direct line of communication with the past. We can now hear the voice of a Mesopotamian merchant complaining about the poor quality of copper he received, or understand the concerns of a Mycenaean palace official accounting for every jar of olive oil. It shows us that these were not primitive, isolated cultures but organized, literate societies engaged in the same daily struggles and triumphs that define our own lives. Their voices echoing clearly across the vast expanse of time, thanks to the permanence of clay and the perseverance of those who refused to let their stories stay silent. Now consider the sheer scale of this ancient commerce. These weren't just local farmers trading with the next village over. These were vast, organized enterprises. We have tablets from the city of for instance, that detail the operations of a massive merchant family, the House of Egibai, who operated like a multinational corporation. Their records span generations, showing complex transactions involving credit, loans, and partnerships. They would finance expeditions, insure goods against loss, and even deal in futures contracts, agreeing to buy a harvest before it was even planted. This required an incredible level of trust and a shared legal framework that could be enforced across great distances. How did they manage this without modern communication? The clay tablet was their binding contract, their invoice, and their ledger. A deal struck in Assyria would be recorded in duplicate, with each party holding a copy. If a dispute arose, those hardened slabs of clay were brought out as the ultimate evidence, their permanence ensuring that a promise made months earlier and hundreds of miles away could still be honored. This sophisticated economic interdependence meant that a drought in Anatolia could affect copper prices in Mesopotamia, and a political dispute in the Levant could disrupt the supply of purple dye to Egypt. They were tied together in a web of mutual need, where the prosperity of one region often depended on the stability and cooperation of another, a reality that feels remarkably familiar to us today. Beyond the flow of goods and money, these clay tablets carried something even more precious, the very soul of a culture. They were the ancient world's internet, not for moving merchandise, but for transmitting ideas, stories, and beliefs across vast distances, creating a shared cultural landscape that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. Think of it not as a simple trade route, but as a cultural highway where myths, deities, and innovations were the most valued commodities. The most stunning example of this is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This magnificent tale of an arrogant king's quest for immortality was born in the city-states of Sumer, but we haven't just found it in one place. Fragments of the story have been discovered on tablets in Anatolia, in the Levant, and in Megiddo, showing it traveled for over 1,000 years and across countless borders. As it moved, the story itself evolved, absorbing local flavors and themes, much like a folk song that gains new verses as it passes from singer to singer. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a profound exploration of universal human themes: friendship, loss, and the fear of death, that resonated deeply with people everywhere. The influence of this Mesopotamian epic is palpable in later masterpieces. The parallels between Gilgamesh's companion Enkidu and the Greek Achilles are striking, and the story of a great flood sent by disgruntled gods, complete with a hero who builds a boat to save life on Earth, echoes unmistakably in the biblical narrative of Noah. This proves these stories were not developed in isolation, but were part of a grand, conversational exchange of ideas that shaped the foundational literature of the Western world. This cultural exchange went far beyond storytelling, seeping into the very spiritual fabric of ancient life. People were remarkably open to adopting and adapting the gods of their trading partners and neighbors. The Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, associated with love, war, and fertility, is a prime example. Her worship spread like wildfire from the heart of Babylon to the coasts of Syria, where she was embraced as a start, and even further, influencing the Greek Aphrodite and potentially the Phoenician Tanit. This wasn't a case of conquest forcing a religion upon people. It was a voluntary, organic process of spiritual syncretism. A merchant traveling to a foreign city might see the power in a local deity and begin making offerings, or a diplomat might bring home tales of a powerful new god who could ensure a good harvest or victory in battle. Tablets found in the archives of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, are particularly revealing. They show a conscious and systematic effort by the Hittites to incorporate the gods of all the peoples they conquered into their own official pantheon. They would literally sign treaties with these foreign deities, inviting them to reside in Hattusan temples and receive offerings. This was a brilliant political and cultural strategy, a way of saying to subject peoples, "Your gods are welcome here. We are all under the same divine umbrella." It fostered a sense of inclusion and stability across a diverse empire. The transfer of knowledge wasn't limited to the metaphysical. It was intensely practical, changing the way people built, cooked, and governed their daily lives. Architectural innovations are a clear testament to this. The concept of the monumental, raised temple platform known as a ziggurat originated in Mesopotamia, but its influence can be seen in the elevated sanctuaries of other cultures. Techniques for forging stronger bronze alloys using tin from far-off Afghanistan were carefully recorded on tablets and shared along merchant routes, leading to better tools and weapons from Egypt to Greece. Even something as personal as cuisine was subject to this cross-pollination. Cuneiform tablets include what are essentially the world's oldest known recipes, detailed instructions for stews, breads, and soups. Spices like cumin and coriander, once exotic luxuries, became staples in kitchens across the Near East because tablets documented their use and trade. A culinary fashion for Mesopotamian-style dishes might have swept through the elite circles of foreign capitals, much like a viral food trend today. This constant, vibrant exchange of the mundane and the magnificent, the spiritual and the practical, woven together through the medium of clay, created a rich tapestry of shared human experience. It demonstrates that these ancient networks were not cold, calculating economic systems but living, breathing circuits of culture, fostering a common heritage that reminds us our ancestors were always connected, always learning from one another, and always building a world together. Imagine the sheer challenge of governing an empire without telephones, without the internet, without even a reliable postal service. How did a ruler in the capital city know what was happening in a distant province, how much grain was in its silos, or whether taxes had been collected? The answer lies in the most unassuming of objects, the administrative clay tablet. These were not epic poems or royal decrees, but the lifeblood of the state, the ancient equivalent of cloud servers and spreadsheets, meticulously tracking every resource and every obligation across vast territories. In the great archives of cities like Ebla or the Hittite capital of Hattusa, we find tablets that are breathtaking in their mundane detail. One lists the daily bread rations for thousands of workers, categorized by their job and status. Another is a precise inventory of textiles, noting the quantity, quality, and destination of each bolt of cloth. A third might record the yield of a specific barley field down to the smallest measure, the amount sent to the central granary, and even the names of the officials who oversaw the shipment. This was data collection on a monumental scale, and it was the absolute foundation of imperial power. The genius of this system was its hierarchical and standardized nature. Scribes across the empire were trained in the same methods, using the same units of measurement and the same formats for their reports. A tablet generated in a remote agricultural outpost would be structured identically to one from a bustling port city, creating a common language of administration that transcended local dialects and customs. These reports would flow inward from village to district, from district to provincial capital, and finally to the central palace administration. Officials at the top could then collate this information, getting a bird's-eye view of the entire empire's economic health. They could see which regions were running a surplus and which were facing a shortfall, allowing for strategic redistribution of goods. If a drought struck one area, supplies could be diverted from a more fertile region to prevent famine and maintain stability. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was a powerful tool for preventing rebellion. By ensuring a steady and fair flow of resources, the central authority could foster loyalty and demonstrate its essential role in the well-being of its subjects. This bureaucratic machine also managed the most complex resource of all, human labor. Tablets from the Roman III period in Mesopotamia document the corvée labor system, a form of compulsory service owed to the state. The records are astonishingly precise. They list individuals by name, their assigned tasks, whether digging irrigation canals, building temple foundations, or harvesting royal lands, and the exact duration of their service. Scribes even accounted for absences, noting if someone was sick or had run away. This allowed for incredibly sophisticated project management. A ruler could mobilize thousands of workers for massive construction projects, confident that the system would track their contributions and ensure they were fed and managed. The distribution of goods followed the same meticulous principles. We have tablets that are essentially ancient pay stubs, showing the allocation of oil, wool, and grain to everyone from high priests to lowly laborers, all calculated according to their rank and contribution. This created a predictable, orderly economy where everyone knew their place and their due, minimizing conflict and maximizing productivity. The survival of these clay databases proves that the ancient world's greatest architectural marvels, its ziggurats, its fortified walls, its irrigation networks were not just feats of engineering, but triumphs of administration, all made possible by the humble act of pressing a stylus into wet clay. But the true power of these administrative systems wasn't just in managing grain and labor. It was in their ability to codify and enforce a universal sense of justice. Moving from ledgers to law, we find that clay tablets became the bedrock of social order, preserving some of humanity's first and most ambitious attempts to create a society governed by rules, not just by the whims of a ruler. The most famous of these is undoubtedly the Code of Hammurabi. Imagine a towering black stone stele, erected in the heart of Babylon around 1750 BC for all to see. At the top, a carved scene shows the sun god Shamash, the god of justice, handing the law to King Hammurabi himself. This powerful image sent an unmistakable message. These laws were not merely the king's invention, they were divinely sanctioned, eternal, and just. But the stele itself was a public monument. The actual day-to-day functioning of the law happened on those ubiquitous clay tablets, which were copied and distributed to courts and officials across the Babylonian Empire. The code itself was breathtakingly comprehensive, addressing nearly every aspect of life. It laid out fixed prices for goods and services, established wages for different professions, and set out clear rules for commercial transactions like loans and rentals. It delved into family law covering marriage contracts, inheritance rights, and divorce, and it established a fundamental, if harsh, principle of justice, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, often summarized as an eye for an eye. This wasn't merely about brutal punishment, it was about proportionality. The code aimed to limit cycles of vengeance by ensuring the punishment precisely matched the crime, whether it involved a stolen ox or a physical assault. What makes these legal principles so revolutionary, however, is that they were not confined within Babylon's walls. The influence of Hammurabi's code, and others like it, traveled along those same trade routes that carried lapis lazuli and tin. We find echoes of its structure and its spirit in the legal systems of the Hittites, the Assyrians, and other contemporary cultures. This was a form of early legal harmonization, a shared framework that made cross-cultural trade and diplomacy possible. A merchant from Assyria doing business in Babylon would have a reasonable understanding of the legal consequences of breaking a contract, the principles of evidence, the requirement for witnesses, and the very idea that a dispute should be settled in a court of law according to a written standard. These concepts became a common language of justice. This shared legal understanding was absolutely essential for building trust. If you were going to send a caravan of valuable goods across hundreds of miles of desert into another kingdom, you needed confidence that a legal system existed there to protect your investment and enforce agreements. The clay tablet was the physical guarantor of that trust. A contract inscribed on clay and sealed by witnesses was a legally binding document that could be presented in a foreign court. Beyond the famous codes, countless other tablets offer us a glimpse into how this legal machinery worked on the ground. We have extensive records of actual court cases, providing a fascinating and often surprisingly relatable look at ancient litigation. There are cases dealing with divorce settlements, where a woman is granted her freedom and a stipulated payment of silver. There are inheritance disputes between siblings, argued before a panel of judges. There are even cases of false accusations, where the penalty for bringing a malicious suit without evidence could be severe. One particularly vivid case involves a merchant accused of selling substandard copper. The tablet records the testimony of both parties, the examination of the evidence, the copper itself, and the final judgment of the judges. This is not some abstract legal theory. It is justice in action, captured in the meticulous script of a court scribe. These tablets show us that the law was a living, breathing institution, accessible to more than just the elite. Ordinary citizens could and did use the courts to resolve their disputes, relying on the permanence of the clay record to ensure a fair and lasting outcome. This robust legal framework, disseminated and enforced through tablets, was the glue that held the ancient world's first experiments in globalization together. It reduced the inherent risk of dealing with strangers from different cultures, providing a predictable and reliable system that enabled commerce to flourish, alliances to form, and a fragile but real sense of international order to take root. While kings and merchants focused on the earth beneath their feet, ancient scribes were also meticulously recording the patterns of the heavens above, creating an astronomical legacy that remains awe-inspiring to this day. Among the most extraordinary of these celestial documents are the Venus tablets of Ammisajuka, a series of cuneiform tablets that date back to the 17th century BC. For 21 years, Babylonian astronomers tracked the movements of the planet Venus with painstaking precision, noting its first and last appearances as a morning star and an evening star, its periods of visibility, and its disappearances behind the sun. The accuracy of their observations is staggering. Modern astronomers have verified their data, finding it aligns closely with our current understanding of Venus's 584-day cycle. This was not a casual hobby. It was a rigorous, state-sponsored scientific endeavor. The astronomers were likely temple scribes, and their work was considered vitally important because they believed the gods communicated their will through the motions of the celestial bodies. A sudden eclipse or an unusual planetary alignment could be an omen of impending war, a plague, or the death of a king. By meticulously recording these patterns, they were essentially building a database to predict the future, seeking to understand the moods of the gods and prepare the kingdom for what was to come. This celestial data served profoundly practical purposes that governed daily life for everyone, from the farmer in his field to the king on his throne. The most immediate application was the creation of an accurate calendar. The lunar-based calendars of the ancient world constantly fell out of sync with the solar year, which dictated the agricultural seasons. By carefully observing the stars, particularly the heliacal rising of key constellations like Sirius or the Pleiades, scribes could determine the correct time to plant, to harvest, and to perform essential religious festivals. A tablet might instruct that when the constellation of Leo was high in the sky, it was time to begin the barley harvest. This astronomical scheduling was crucial for food security and economic stability. Furthermore, the development of astrology, which was indistinguishable from astronomy at the time, provided a framework for decision-making at all levels. Before laying the foundation stone for a new temple, signing a major trade treaty, or even embarking on a long journey, a king would consult his court astrologers. These scholars would reference their tablets of celestial omens, checking the position of the planets to determine the most auspicious day for the undertaking. This practice infused a sense of order and divine sanction into the unpredictable chaos of human affairs, turning the vast, silent cosmos into a readable guidebook for earthly life. The truly revolutionary aspect of this astronomical knowledge is that it did not remain locked within one culture. There is compelling evidence that these detailed observations were shared across vast networks, forming an early scientific community. The meticulous Babylonian data on lunar cycles and planetary movements appears to have influenced astronomical traditions in Egypt, Greece, and even the distant Indus Valley civilization. While direct written evidence from the Indus Valley remains undeciphered, archaeological finds show a remarkable interest in celestial alignment. The layout of major cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa suggests a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, with certain streets and structures aligned to cardinal points and significant astronomical events like solstices. It is not difficult to imagine Babylonian merchants or diplomats traveling along established trade routes, carrying with them not just goods but also ideas, including clay tablets containing crucial astronomical data. This shared celestial knowledge became a universal language, a common ground for different cultures to connect. A priest in Mesopotamia and a scholar in the Indus Valley, though they might worship different gods and speak different languages, could both look up at the same evening star and understand its cycle, its significance, and its power. This collective observation of the heavens created a bond of intellectual curiosity that transcended political borders and cultural differences, uniting humanity in a shared quest to comprehend the greatest mystery of all, the cosmos itself. While the heavens offered one kind of map, the ancient world possessed another, far more abstract one, the language of mathematics, and it was on these very same clay tablets that this revolutionary system of thought was being meticulously developed to a degree of sophistication that would not be matched for centuries. We often picture ancient mathematics as simple counting or basic arithmetic, but the reality is they were performing feats of calculation and geometry that remain impressive even by today's standards. The most stunning example of this is a small, unassuming clay tablet known as Plimpton 322, currently housed at Columbia University. Dated to around 1800 BC, this tablet is not a shopping list or a tax record. It is essentially a trigonometric table, a precise and organized list of Pythagorean triples. For those who might not remember from school, a Pythagorean triple is a set of three whole numbers that perfectly fit the famous theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, describing the sides of a right-angled triangle. The Babylonians were using these triples over 1,000 years before the Greek philosopher Pythagoras was even born. The precision and sheer number of triples listed on Plimpton 32215 in total prove this was not a lucky guess or a one-off discovery. It was the result of a deep methodological understanding of number theory and geometry. They had discovered a formula for generating these triples, a mathematical algorithm that they could apply again and again. This was pure, abstract mathematics for its own sake, a testament to a brilliant intellectual curiosity that sought to understand the fundamental relationships of numbers and shapes. This mathematical genius was not confined to theoretical puzzles. It was the engine that drove the most ambitious practical projects of the ancient world. Think about the immense ziggurats, those massive, stepped temple towers that define the skylines of Mesopotamian cities. Constructing such a colossal edifice out of mud brick, a material that settles and compresses over time, required incredibly precise calculations. Architects had to compute volumes of materials, angles for ramps and staircases, and ensure structural integrity, all using the mathematical principles preserved on their tablets. The same is true for their vast and complex irrigation networks, which transformed arid plains into fertile farmland. Canals had to be dug with just the right gradient, not too steep to cause erosion, and not too shallow to allow stagnation. This required a sophisticated understanding of slope and volume, of how to move earth and direct water over long distances using nothing but manual labor and mathematical foresight. In the realm of astronomy, their advanced math was indispensable, predicting the movement of planets, calculating the length of a lunar month, or determining the exact timing of an eclipse all required complex arithmetic and geometric models. Their ability to do this so accurately shows a society that had fully integrated advanced mathematics into its scientific and religious worldview, using numbers to decode the very order of the universe. Perhaps the most relatable application, however, was in the bustling marketplace and the merchant's office. Mathematics was the key to a fair and flourishing economy. Tablets are filled with calculations for compound interest on loans, the exchange rates between different weights of silver and copper, and the complex pricing of goods based on quantity and quality. A merchant importing timber from Lebanon would need to calculate the volume of wood in a log, convert its value into a standardized weight of silver, account for transportation costs, and perhaps even factor in an insurance premium, all using the sexagesimal system, a base 60-numeral system that we still use today for measuring time and angles. This system, with its easy divisibility by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, made mental arithmetic and fractions far more practical than our modern base 10 system for many commercial transactions. This mathematical precision built the trust necessary for long-distance trade. A business partner in a distant city could be confident that the calculations on a clay tablet invoice were correct and based on a mutually understood system. This shared language of numbers was as vital as any spoken language for facilitating the smooth flow of goods and capital across cultures. proving that innovation in abstract thought was directly linked to practical, tangible prosperity. The million-dollar question is, how did this sophisticated knowledge spread? The evidence suggests that mathematical concepts were a highly valued form of intellectual property, traded and exchanged along the same routes as spices and precious metals. We see the unmistakable influence of Babylonian mathematics in later Greek, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. The Greek historian Herodotus even claimed that the geometry for which Greece became famous actually originated in Egypt, where it was needed to re-establish field boundaries after the annual flooding of the Nile. This itself was likely a technology that had been refined and disseminated from earlier Mesopotamian practices. It is not difficult to imagine a scene where scribes from different cultures, meeting in a trading hub or at a royal court, would share not just goods but also ideas. They might demonstrate a new algorithm for calculating interest or a more efficient geometric proof. These scholarly exchanges would have been a natural part of diplomatic and commercial missions, as envoys and merchants carried the most valuable cargo of all, knowledge. The existence of nearly identical mathematical problems and solutions on tablets found hundreds of miles apart is the smoking gun for this early network of intellectual exchange. It shows that innovation was never the sole property of one brilliant, isolated civilization. Instead, it was a collective human achievement, a conversation conducted across generations and continents, with each culture adding its own insights and refinements, building a shared foundation of understanding upon which all future science and engineering would ultimately rest. Moving from the abstract realms of mathematics and astronomy, we find that the ancient scribes applied the same meticulous record-keeping to something far more intimate and universal, the human body itself. The clay tablets that tracked the movements of planets and calculated interest rates were also used to document the earliest known system of medicine, creating a fascinating window into how our ancestors understood health, illness, and healing. Among the most significant discoveries are the libraries of Assyrian kings, particularly Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which contained thousands of tablets dedicated solely to medical knowledge. These were not random collections of folk remedies. They were organized textbooks systematically categorizing diseases, symptoms, and treatments. A typical medical tablet might begin with a diagnosis. If a man's temples contain a pressure and his eyes are cloudy and he vomits bile, followed by a detailed prescription for a remedy. The ingredients read like an ancient apothecary's shopping list: myrrh and thyme, powdered willow bark, dates and honey, all mixed into a base of beer or wine to be ingested or applied as a salve. What is truly striking is the empirical, almost scientific approach evident in these texts. The physicians, known as Asu, were careful observers. They took detailed patient histories, noted the progression of symptoms over days, and even recognized that some illnesses were contagious. This was evidence-based medicine in its most nascent form, a centuries-long project of trial and error, with successful treatments being recorded and passed down through generations of healers. Yet to view this solely through a modern, scientific lens would be to miss half the picture. The ancient world, you did not separate the physical from the spiritual. Illness was often understood as a divine punishment or the work of a demon, a ghost, or a sorcerer's curse. Therefore, a truly effective treatment had to address both the body and the spirit. This is where the second type of healer, the Ashapu or exorcist, came in. His role was to diagnose the supernatural cause of an ailment through divination, and then combat it with incantations, rituals, and amulets. A single patient might be treated by both specialists simultaneously, the Asu applying a poultice of crushed herbs to reduce a fever, while the Ashapu performed a ritual to drive out the demon believed to be causing it. This holistic approach, which seems so foreign to us now, was in fact a comprehensive system that addressed the patient's entire reality. It acknowledged that fear, guilt, and spiritual anxiety could manifest as physical symptoms, and that a treatment was incomplete if it only dealt with the bodily effects. A tablet might prescribe a precise mixture of herbs and then instruct the healer to recite a specific prayer to the god Marduk 7 times while the patient drank the concoction. This blending of the practical and the spiritual wasn't seen as contradictory. It was the only logical way to tackle a problem that had both tangible and intangible dimensions. The most compelling evidence for a connected ancient world of healing comes from the remarkable similarities found in medical texts across great distances and different cultures. A recipe for a wound salve found on a cuneiform tablet in Mesopotamia might bear a stunning resemblance to one described on a papyrus in Egypt. Both could call for the same combination of honey, which we now know has natural antibacterial properties, and certain resins like frankincense, which acts as an anti-inflammatory. The famed Ebers papyrus from Egypt, dating to around 1550 BCE, and the various Mesopotamian diagnostic handbooks, though separated by centuries and geography, share a common conceptual framework. They both describe a system of channels in the body, similar to the concept of metu in Egypt or the vessels in Mesopotamia, through which fluids and air were thought to flow. Blockages or imbalances in these channels were believed to cause disease. This suggests more than just independent invention. It points to an active exchange of medical knowledge. How did this happen? It is easy to imagine a traveling physician accompanying a merchant caravan, sharing a new remedy for toothache with a local healer at a trading post. Diplomatic gifts between royal courts often included skilled physicians, and we have records of Egyptian doctors being highly prized in the Hittite court. These experts would have brought their medical texts and traditions with them, which were then translated, adapted, and incorporated into the local practice. A treatment for an eye infection developed on the banks of the Nile could, within a generation or two, be found inscribed on a tablet in a library on the Tigris River. Its Egyptian origins perhaps forgotten, but its practical benefits now a part of a shared medical heritage. This cross-cultural collaboration in healthcare reveals something profound about these ancient societies. The pursuit of well-being was a universal priority that transcended political borders and cultural differences. In a world without antibiotics, vaccines, or modern surgery, disease and injury were constant, terrifying threats. The search for effective remedies was a matter of survival, and it fostered a pragmatic openness to new ideas from anywhere they might come. If a distant culture had a reputation for effective healing, their knowledge was worth acquiring, translating, and testing. This created a vast, informal network of experimentation where the only thing that truly mattered was results. A remedy that worked was adopted and refined, regardless of its origin. This early global project of medical sharing laid the essential groundwork for all future advances. The extensive pharmacological knowledge recorded on these tablets, the understanding of hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products, and their effects on the human body became the foundation upon which Greek, Roman, Islamic, and eventually modern Western medicine were built. The ancient healers, guided by observation and a deep desire to alleviate suffering, initiated a conversation about health that has continued for millennia, their wisdom preserved in the humble, resilient medium of clay, ensuring that even their failures and successes could teach the generations that followed. Beyond the ledgers of trade and the charts of the stars, the ancient scribes reserved some of their most careful craftsmanship for a purpose that feels deeply, wonderfully human: the telling of stories. These weren't just tales to pass the time. They were the very bedrock of cultural identity. the myths that explained a people's place in the cosmos, and the poetry that gave voice to their most intimate emotions, all immortalized in the enduring medium of clay. Consider the sheer range of this literary world. We have soaring creation epics like the Babylonian Enuma Elish, which recounts the cosmic battle between the god Marduk and the primordial sea goddess Tiamat, a story performed during the New Year festival to reaffirm the king's divine right to rule and the order of the universe itself. Yet in the very same archives, we find something far more personal and relatable, exquisitely tender love poetry. In one Sumerian poem, a priestess of the goddess Inanna sings of her clandestine meetings with a king, describing how her lover's words are sweeter than honey, and how merely hearing his voice makes her heart flutter like a dove in a tree. This is a voice that transcends millennia, expressing a universal human experience with a freshness and immediacy that collapses the centuries between us. We have hymns of praise that were sung in temples, their rhythmic lines carefully composed to please the ears of the gods, and we have witty fables where animals talk and scheme, offering moral lessons and social satire. This incredible diversity shows that ancient literature was not a monolith. It was a vibrant ecosystem of genres, each serving a different purpose, from reinforcing state power to exploring the most private corners of the human heart. What makes this literary tradition truly breathtaking, however, is its dynamic, traveling nature. These stories were not meant to gather dust on a shelf in one city. They were designed to be shared, performed, and most importantly, adapted. The epic tales we often think of as fixed were actually incredibly fluid, changing as they moved from one culture to the next to resonate with new audiences. The best example of this is, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It began as a cycle of independent Sumerian poems about the legendary king of Uruk. But as the story traveled north into Akkadian-speaking Babylon, it was transformed. A brilliant Babylonian scribe named Sin-Leqi Nini edited these scattered tales into a single, unified masterpiece, weaving in new themes and deepening the psychological portrait of its hero. He gave us the poignant story of Enkidu's death and Gilgamesh's desperate, futile quest for immortality, turning it from a simple adventure into a profound meditation on loss, grief, and the acceptance of human mortality. This new, refined version then became the hit of the ancient world. Copies of it have been found across the Near East, from the Hittite capital of Hattusa to Megiddo in Canaan. In each place, local scribes would sometimes make small adjustments, perhaps translating a name or emphasizing a theme that was more relevant to their own culture. This process is exactly how narratives survive and thrive, not by remaining frozen in time, but by evolving, absorbing new influences, and staying relevant to each new generation that encounters them. The most compelling evidence for a deeply interconnected ancient world lies in the discovery of these shared narrative building blocks, these universal themes that appear in cultures that had no known direct contact with each other. The flood myth is the most famous case. The story of a righteous man warned by a god to build a boat and save his family and the animals from a world-destroying deluge is central to the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh his story. But we find strikingly similar narratives in so many other places. There's the biblical account of Noah, the ancient Greek myth of Deucalion and Pirha, and even a flood story in the much later Norse prose Edda. While direct borrowing is difficult to prove across such vast gaps of time and space, the prevalence of this theme suggests something fundamental about the human experience, perhaps a collective memory of catastrophic environmental events like the flooding of the Black Sea Basin around 5600 BC. These shared myths point to a common mythological heritage, a pool of archetypal stories that early humans carried with them as they migrated, and that were then refined and retold in isolation. However, in the densely networked world of the ancient Near East, the lines between independent invention and direct influence become wonderfully blurred. The discovery of a fragment of the Gilgamesh epic in the ruins of Megiddo, dating to the 14th century BC, proves that the story was known in Canaan centuries before the earliest versions of the Noah story were written down. This doesn't mean one copied the other, but it strongly suggests a long period of cross-cultural fertilization, where stories were heard, remembered, and retold, their elements slowly weaving their way into the local folklore and sacred texts of neighboring peoples. This was a world engaged in a constant, unconscious collaboration of the imagination. This grand exchange of narratives did more than just provide entertainment. It actively built a shared spiritual and artistic foundation for the ancient world. When a people adopted and adapted a foreign myth, they weren't just borrowing a cool story. They were acknowledging a connection, finding a point of common understanding with their neighbors. The story became a bridge. The figure of the goddess Ishtar, for instance, is not just a character in Mesopotamian myth. Her stories traveled with merchants and diplomats, and she was worshipped under different names from Anatolia to Egypt. Hearing a story about her power and her caprices would have given a foreign listener a framework for understanding the culture from which it came. This literary exchange fostered a sense of common humanity, a realization that despite different languages and customs, people everywhere grappled with the same big questions about life, death, love, and power. They found comfort in similar heroic journeys and caution in similar tales of hubris. This ancient narrative network, powered by the humble clay tablet, enriched every culture it touched, providing a deeper, more colorful tapestry of belief and expression. It reminds us that the human need for story is as old as civilization itself, and that through sharing our stories, we have always built the most enduring bridges between our isolated worlds. Now let's step into the heart of ancient geopolitics, a world where the fate of empires could hinge on the words inscribed on a single tablet of clay. The most extraordinary window into this world comes from a chance discovery in 1887, when a local woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of the Egyptian city of Akhetaten, now known as Amarna, unearthed a cache of nearly 400 clay tablets. These weren't tax records or religious hymns. They were the diplomatic cables of the 14th century BCE, the confidential correspondence between the Pharaoh of Egypt and the other great powers of the day, the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, as well as the vassal rulers of Canaanite city-states. This archive, known today as the Amarna Letters, pulls back the curtain on a sophisticated and surprisingly familiar world of international diplomacy, a delicate dance of power, flattery, and realpolitik conducted across vast distances. The very language of these letters reveals the first rule of this ancient diplomatic game, a shared vocabulary of power and respect. Remarkably, most of these letters, even those sent from non-Mesopotamian kingdoms like Egypt, were written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of international relations, using the Cuneiform script. This was the ancient equivalent of everyone at the United Nations using English. It was a practical necessity for clear communication, but within this common language, an intricate etiquette governed every word. Great kings addressed each other with the familial title brother, a powerful term that signaled they were equals on the world stage, members of an exclusive club of superpowers. The letters are filled with extravagant, almost poetic greetings. A typical opening from the Babylonian king to the pharaoh might read, "Say to the king of Egypt, my brother, thus says the king of Babylon, your brother. I and my household, my horses, my chariots, and my officials are all very well." This wasn't just polite small talk. it was a crucial reaffirmation of mutual respect and peaceful intentions, the necessary preamble to any serious negotiation. Beneath this veneer of brotherly affection, however, the letters reveal the hard-nosed realities of international trade and alliance building. The exchange of lavish gifts was the absolute cornerstone of this system, and the correspondence is filled with meticulous, sometimes complaining, inventories of these shipments. A king might send 20 pounds of lapis lazuli, 5 teams of horses, and a shipment of fine ivory to his brother, fully expecting an equally magnificent counter-gift in return. The value and quality of these gifts were a direct reflection of the health of the relationship. Some of the most amusingly relatable letters are essentially ancient complaints about cheap gifts. The king of Babylon, Bernabariashroman II, writes a scathing letter to the pharaoh Akhenaten, essentially accusing him of sending a carload of junk. He points out that the gold sent was not only insufficient but underweight, and that the chariots and horses were so subpar they were an embarrassment. He even notes that his own father would never have been treated with such disrespect, a clear attempt to guilt-trip the Egyptian king into upping his gift game. This wasn't mere greed. In a world without standardized currency, the exchange of prestige goods was a primary economic driver and a vital measure of a king's wealth and power. A magnificent gift demonstrated respect and solidified the bond, while a cheap one was a grave diplomatic insult. Perhaps the most powerful tool of diplomacy, immortalized in these clay tablets, was the proposed marriage alliance. Kings would offer their daughters in marriage to their counterparts, a practice that wove a web of familial ties across the political landscape. These negotiations were incredibly detailed and fraught with tension. A letter from the king of Mitanni offers his daughter to the pharaoh Amenhotep III, but includes a list of demands worthy of any modern prenuptial agreement, specifying the exact amount of gold her retinue was to receive. The pharaoh, in turn, might write back questioning the princess's beauty or lineage, seeking to ensure he was getting a worthy addition to his royal household. The safe passage of these royal brides and their enormous dowries was a matter of high-level diplomatic security, with kings writing to each other to guarantee safe conduct through each other's territories. A successful marriage created a blood bond between dynasties, a personal stake that could help prevent war and ensure mutual support. It turned a foreign king from a distant figure into a father-in-law, a relationship that carried weight and obligation in a way a simple treaty might not. Yet this delicate web of diplomacy was constantly tested by the chaotic realities of the ancient world, and the Amarna letters provide a ground-level view of these crises. The pharaoh, addressed as Sun King by his vassals in Canaan, is bombarded with desperate pleas for military assistance from his local governors. One ruler, Rib-Hadda of Byblos, writes over 60 letters, each growing more panicked as his city is besieged by rivals backed by the Hittites. His letters are a masterclass in manipulative diplomacy, flattering the pharaoh, warning him of the growing danger, and questioning his loyalty if help does not arrive. If the king does not send archers, he writes in one tablet, then all the lands will be joined to the Habaru, referring to bands of marauders. These letters reveal the immense pressure on a great king to maintain his sphere of influence. He had to constantly weigh the cost of sending troops against the risk of appearing weak and losing the loyalty of his far-flung vassals. The diplomacy between the great powers was also shadowed by the constant threat of espionage and double-dealing. Kings frequently accused each other of harboring fugitives or supporting rebellions, demanding the extradition of political enemies who had sought refuge at a rival's court. The trust was fragile, and maintaining it required a constant stream of letters, reassurances, explanations, and promises, all carefully crafted to prevent a minor dispute from erupting into a major war. This entire system, preserved in the fired clay of the Amarna archive, demonstrates a breathtaking level of political sophistication. These ancient rulers understood that in an interconnected world, isolation was not an option. They managed complex, long-distance relationships through a shared protocol of communication, using marriage, gifts, and flattery to build alliances that ensured stability and prosperity for their realms. The clay tablet was the indispensable technology that made this possible. It provided a permanent, unalterable record of agreements and promises, a document that could be stored, referenced, and presented as evidence. It allowed a king in Egypt to conduct a nuanced foreign policy with a king in Babylon, despite a journey that would have taken months. This was not a primitive prelude to modern diplomacy. It was a fully realized system in its own right, a testament to the fact that the challenges and solutions of international relations are a constant thread in the human story, connecting us across the millennia through the enduring medium of clay. While the exchange of stories and diplomatic niceties built cultural bridges, the true engine of ancient progress was the relentless, practical sharing of how to do things better. The clay tablets that recorded poems and treaties also served as the world's first technical manuals and patents, meticulously documenting the transfer of transformative technologies that spread along the very same trade routes that carried spices and jewels. This was not a passive drift of ideas. It was an active, deliberate pursuit of knowledge, where a new metal alloy or a more efficient irrigation design was a treasure as valuable as any chest of gold. Imagine a merchant caravan not just laden with goods, but also carrying in the minds of its travelers the latest innovation in wheel-making from the workshops of Ur, or a diplomatic envoy presenting a new metallurgical technique as a gift more precious than any statue. These technological breakthroughs, once achieved in one region, did not remain a local secret for long. They were observed, learned, reverse-engineered, and most importantly, written down, becoming a portable form of power that could be traded, sold, or gifted to allies, fundamentally reshaping the capabilities of every society that adopted them. Consider the revolutionary impact of metallurgy, arguably one of the most significant technologies in human history. The progression from simple copper tools to harder, more durable bronze required a precise understanding of alloying, mixing copper with tin or arsenic. This knowledge was complex and not easily stumbled upon. Cuneiform tablets from Anatolia, a region rich in metal ores, provide detailed recipes and instructions for smelting and casting. What's fascinating is that these technical texts show striking similarities to methods described in Mesopotamian sources. The specific ratios of metals, the temperatures for the furnaces, and even the designs for bellows to achieve those temperatures are echoed across these different cultures. This is the smoking gun for technological transfer. It wasn't that both cultures independently invented the exact same intricate process. It was that knowledge, likely carried by expert smiths traveling with trading expeditions or offered employment by foreign kings, was shared and then locally adapted. A Mesopotamian tablet might record the receipt of a shipment of Anatolian tin, but the more valuable cargo was the knowledge that came with it, the know-how to transform that raw material into weapons that could conquer an army or tools that could plow a field twice as fast. This collaborative innovation extended far beyond the forge and into the very earth that sustained these civilizations. Agriculture was the foundation of every ancient society, and its productivity was directly tied to technological mastery over water. The arid plains of Mesopotamia were transformed into a lush garden through an immense network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, a feat of hydraulic engineering that required incredible planning and skill. Tablets from the Sumerian city of Lagash detail the administration of these massive public works projects, assigning thousands of laborers to dig and maintain canals. The techniques for surveying land to ensure the correct, gentle slope for water flow, for constructing strong levees to control flooding, and for designing sluice gates to distribute water evenly were highly advanced. As merchants and diplomats traveled, they carried descriptions of these systems. The Hittites in Anatolia, for instance, adopted and adapted these irrigation methods for their own highland plains. This shared hydrological knowledge turned regions that were once marginal for farming into breadbaskets, supporting larger populations and fueling the growth of cities. The technology of water management, carefully recorded on clay tablets, was a gift that kept on giving, enabling survival and prosperity in challenging environments across the ancient world. Perhaps no invention is more iconic of ancient technology than the wheel, but its development was far from straightforward. The earliest wheels were simple, solid discs, heavy and inefficient. The breakthrough to the spoked wheel, which was lighter and allowed for the development of faster chariots, was a monumental leap in design. The evidence suggests this innovation likely originated in the Eurasian steppes and was then rapidly adopted and refined by civilizations like the Mesopotamians and the Hittites. While we may not have a tablet that says how to build a spoked wheel, we have countless tablets that illustrate their adoption through inventory lists. Armies meticulously recorded their numbers of chariots of the new type, and royal edicts allocated precious timber specifically for their construction. The rapid spread of this superior technology, from the steppes to the palaces of the Near East within a few centuries, speaks to a world that was intensely aware of technological developments elsewhere and eager to acquire any military or economic advantage. The wheel itself became a vehicle not just for travel, but for the very transfer of ideas, carrying new technologies further and faster than ever before. The driving force behind this fervent exchange was simple, a tangible, measurable benefit. A kingdom that acquired a better metalworking technique could produce superior weapons, dominating its enemies and securing valuable resources. A region that implemented advanced irrigation could weather droughts, avoid famine, and generate surplus wealth through increased agricultural taxes. This practical incentive made technological knowledge a highly sought-after commodity. Runners and messengers were sent specifically to observe and report back on the practices of other cultures. Kings would specifically request experts, skilled smiths, experienced engineers, master potters, as part of diplomatic treaties, or would even engage in what we might now call industrial espionage to learn the secrets of a rival's craftsmanship. The clay tablets are filled with these requests and reports, underscoring that this was a conscious, deliberate policy. They understood that knowledge was power, and the power to shape metal, control water, and build faster was the key to security, prosperity, and legacy. This relentless pursuit of improvement, documented in the unwavering medium of clay, turned isolated flashes of genius into a rising tide of progress that lifted entire civilizations, weaving them together not just by trade goods, but by the shared tools they used to build their world. Yet the true sophistication of this ancient economy is revealed not in its simple transactions, but in its remarkably advanced financial instruments, which allowed capital to flow and risks to be managed across vast distances. The merchants of Ur and other great trading cities were not just bartering goods, they were pioneering concepts of credit, investment, and insurance that feel startlingly modern. Cuneiform tablets from the archives of the great merchant houses, such as the prolific house of Egibai in Babylon, which operated for over 5 generations, provide us with a detailed ledger of their financial dealings. These were not informal agreements sealed with a handshake. They were legally binding contracts inscribed in duplicate on clay, with one copy for each party, often stored in a clay envelope for added security. A typical loan contract would specify the exact amount of silver lent, the interest rate, which was usually around 20% per annum, the due date for repayment, and the collateral put up by the borrower, which could be anything from a house and field to a member of the borrower's family who would serve as a pledge until the debt was settled. This system of credit was the lifeblood of long-distance trade, providing merchants with the upfront capital needed to finance expensive expeditions to far-off lands to acquire exotic goods. Without access to this liquid capital, a merchant could never afford to outfit a caravan, pay its guards, or purchase goods at the source. The entire engine of interregional commerce would have ground to a halt. Perhaps even more impressive was their development of early forms of partnership and risk management, which distributed the immense dangers of ancient travel. A common arrangement was the commenda or taputum partnership, detailed in numerous contracts. In this system, a sedentary investor, often a wealthy temple or a retired merchant, would provide the capital, the silver and goods for a trading venture. A traveling agent, the active partner, would then take these resources on a long journey to a distant market, trade them, and return with the profits. Upon the successful completion of the journey, the profits would be split according to a pre-agreed ratio, often heavily favoring the agent who had undertaken the physical risk and hardship, perhaps receiving 2/3 of the gain. This was a brilliant way to incentivize entrepreneurship while allowing capital to be put to work by those with the skills and courage to use it. But the risks were very real. A ship could sink in the Persian Gulf, a caravan could be ambushed by bandits, or goods could spoil. To mitigate these catastrophic losses, we see the emergence of proto-insurance clauses in contracts. Some agreements explicitly state that if a loss occurs through no fault of the agent, such as an act of a god or an unavoidable attack by an enemy, the agent is not held personally liable for the lost capital. He would simply return what, if anything, remained, and the investor would absorb the loss. This understanding of shared risk and the distinction between misfortune and negligence was a cornerstone of building the trust necessary for these high-stakes economic activities. This sophisticated financial toolkit did not remain the secret of one city or one culture. It became a shared economic language that facilitated seamless interaction across cultural and political boundaries. The standard measures of value, particularly the shekel of silver, became a universal unit of account. A merchant in Assyria could issue a loan denominated in silver to a partner in Anatolia, confident that the value was understood by both parties. The fundamental structures of contract law, the requirement for witnesses, the use of seals, the specific phrasing of obligations, were adopted and adapted from Mesopotamia by the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the cultures of the Levant. This created an interoperable legal and economic framework. A contract drawn up in the city of Ashur was legally recognizable and enforceable in a trading colony in central Anatolia, hundreds of miles away. This interoperability drastically reduced the transaction costs of doing business with strangers from different cultures. It provided a predictable, reliable system that encouraged investment and fostered the expansion of trade networks. Capital could now flow to where it was most productive, goods could move to where they were most valued, and entrepreneurial talent could be rewarded, all because of a common set of rules etched into clay. This ancient economic revolution, meticulously recorded on thousands of tablets, laid the very foundations for the complex, interconnected global economy we participate in today, proving that the drive to innovate in finance is as old as civilization itself. This remarkable flow of goods, capital, and technology was mirrored by an even deeper, more personal exchange, the trade in gods themselves. The clay tablets that tracked shipments of copper and silver also preserved the intimate details of faith, revealing a world where religious beliefs were not rigid and exclusive, but fluid, adaptable, and constantly enriched through contact with others. This process, known as religious syncretism, was a defining feature of the ancient spiritual landscape, and it's through these inscribed records that we can trace the incredible journeys of deities as they crossed borders and were welcomed into new homes. Consider the goddess known as Inanna to the Sumerians, a figure of immense power associated with love, war, and fertility. As her influence spread north into Akkadian-speaking regions, her name changed to Ishtar, but her core attributes remained, growing even more formidable. This was not the end of her journey. Through the networks of trade and diplomacy, the worship of Ishtar traveled west to Syria, where she was embraced as a start. Phoenician sailors, some of the ancient world's greatest connectors, then carried her cult across the Mediterranean, where she profoundly influenced the development of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. We can follow this entire evolution through dedicatory inscriptions, hymns, and ritual texts on tablets found along these routes, each culture adding its own local flavor while recognizing the same powerful divine force. A merchant praying to Astarte for safe passage at a Syrian port might be using a slightly different name, but the essence of his devotion would have been instantly recognizable to a Babylonian priestess offering a song to Ishtar thousands of miles away. This was not seen as abandoning one's own gods. It was an acknowledgement that a powerful deity could have many names and many faces, and that their influence could extend far beyond any single city or kingdom. The mechanisms behind this spiritual exchange were as practical as they were profound. When traders established a colony or a trading post in a foreign land, they didn't leave their gods behind. They would build small shrines to their protective deities, ensuring their favor continued on foreign soil. Local populations, observing these rituals and perhaps attributing the traders' success to the power of their gods, might begin to make offerings themselves, seeking similar favor for their own endeavors. More formally, the process of conquest often led to a deliberate and strategic incorporation of foreign gods. The Hittites were masters of this practice. Instead of eradicating the religions of the peoples they conquered, they would literally invite their gods to relocate to the Hittite capital, Hattusa. Tablets from their archives detail these divine adoptions, listing the new deities added to the official state pantheon and specifying the offerings and rituals required to keep them content. This was a brilliant political strategy. By honoring the gods of a subjected people, the Hittite king was sending a clear message: you are not conquered in spirit, your traditions are welcome here, and we are now all under the same divine protection. It fostered loyalty and stability by reducing religious resentment and creating a shared spiritual identity that could bind a diverse empire together. A farmer in a conquered territory might feel less animosity toward his Hittite rulers if they were still allowing him to pray to his local storm god, even if that god was now also worshipped in a grand temple in a far-off capital alongside the Hittite pantheon. The evidence for this blending is not just found in lists of gods, it is woven into the very fabric of the myths and rituals recorded on these tablets. We see stories evolving as they travel, absorbing elements from different traditions. A myth about a Mesopotamian god's descent into the underworld might find parallels in later Greek tales, suggesting a slow, centuries-long cross-pollination of narrative themes. Ritual texts show the same syncretic pattern. A single ceremony might invoke gods from 3 or 4 different cultural backgrounds, calling on each for their specific area of expertise to ensure the ritual's total effectiveness. This created a rich, layered spiritual practice that felt both familiar and expansive. For the average person, this likely fostered a remarkable degree of everyday tolerance and curiosity. While you would primarily worship the local gods of your city and your household, you were aware of and might occasionally petition the powerful gods of your trading partners or your neighbors. This spiritual flexibility created a form of common ground, a shared language of devotion that could facilitate interactions between people of different cultures. It was harder to dismiss a foreigner as a complete alien when you understood they were praying to a version of a god you yourself recognized, even if you used a different name. The clay tablets in preserving these prayers, rituals, and myths show us that the ancient world's greatest networks were not just channels for material wealth, but conduits for the soul, building bridges of understanding through a shared, if wonderfully diverse, search for the divine. Behind every meticulously inscribed contract, every astronomical observation, and every diplomatic letter stood a highly trained individual, the scribe. The complex bureaucracies and interconnected networks of the ancient world did not run themselves. They were powered by a class of literate experts whose skills were honed in specialized schools that would feel surprisingly familiar to us today. Across Mesopotamia and later in other centers like Egypt, these institutions, often attached to temples or palaces, were the engines of the state, systematically transforming young students into the administrators, accountants, and scholars who would keep the machinery of civilization running. The evidence for this system is everywhere, often in the most charmingly relatable form: the homework of children who lived over 4,000 years ago. Archaeologists have uncovered entire classrooms where groups of tablets, all containing the same exercise, were found together as if the teacher had just collected them. We have tablets where a master scribe has written a perfect line of cuneiform on the left, and a student has made a shaky, awkward attempt to copy it on the right. We even have tablets where a frustrated teacher has scrawled a correction over a student's messy work, a moment of pedagogical impatience preserved forever in clay. This was education on an industrial scale, designed for a very specific purpose: to produce a standardized, reliable, and literate civil service. The curriculum was rigorous and highly practical, focused on the essential skills needed for a career in administration. The first and most grueling step was simply learning the complex cuneiform writing system itself. Students spent countless hours mastering hundreds of signs, each of which could represent a word, a syllable, or a sound. They practiced by writing long lists of signs organized by shape or theme, memorizing their various meanings and pronunciations. This foundational work was tedious but absolutely essential. From there, they moved on to mathematics, learning the sophisticated sexagesimal system to calculate everything from simple interest on a loan to the volume of a silo or the area of a field. But education wasn't just about rote memorization and calculation. It was also about cultivating a shared cultural and literary heritage. Advanced students studied and copied great works of literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or hymns to the gods. This served a dual purpose. It improved their writing fluency and stylistic elegance, and it immersed them in the values, history, and mythology that bound their civilization together. A scribe wasn't just a human calculator. He was a guardian of tradition, expected to compose a formal letter, draft a legal contract, or record a religious ritual with the appropriate level of eloquence and precision. What is truly astonishing is how standardized this educational model became across vast distances. The same types of exercise tablets, the same lexical lists for vocabulary building, and even the same mathematical problems have been found in scribble schools from the Sumerian city of Nippur to those in far-off Syrian outposts like Emar. This points to a formalized network of scholarly exchange, a shared pedagogical tradition that ensured a scribe trained in one city could easily understand the documents and procedures in another. This interoperability was the secret weapon of ancient globalization. It meant that a merchant from could present a contract to an official in the Levant and be confident that its terms would be understood and enforceable. It meant that an astronomical observation recorded in Babylon could be interpreted and used by a priest in Anatolia. This shared foundation of learning created a continent-wide professional class that spoke the same administrative language, both literally and figuratively. The education of a scribe, therefore, was about far more than individual advancement. It was a crucial investment in social and economic stability, weaving a seamless web of literacy and bureaucratic practice that allowed diverse and distant cultures to cooperate, trade, and thrive together for centuries. While the scribes of Mesopotamia were busy calculating the movements of planets and drafting legal codes, they were also engaged in a far more immediate and urgent task, acting as the world's first climatologists and environmental scientists. The very survival of their river-based civilizations depended on the capricious moods of nature, and they responded by turning their clay tablets into a vast, meticulous database of ecological observation. These aren't just dry historical records, they are a window into a constant, high-stakes battle for survival against droughts, floods, and famine, a battle where accurate data was the only weapon they had. Imagine a scribe stationed by the banks of the Euphrates, not with a poetic scroll, but with a damp clay tablet and a sharp stylus, meticulously noting the river's height against a marked stone column. This was not an academic exercise. The annual, life-giving flood of the rivers was the engine of their agriculture, but its timing and intensity were everything. A flood that came too early could wash away young seedlings. One that was too weak would leave the fields parched and unproductive. By recording these water levels year after year, generation after generation, these scribes were building a predictive model. They could begin to discern patterns, to understand what a certain water level in 1 month might mean for the harvest several months later. This was data-driven decision-making on a colossal scale, with the food security of entire cities hanging in the balance. The scope of their environmental monitoring was astonishingly broad. Beyond river levels, tablets from cities like Babylon and contained detailed observations of weather patterns. They recorded unusual cold snaps that could damage date palm crops, periods of prolonged drought that threatened the water supply, and devastating storms that damaged infrastructure. One tablet might soberly report a failure of the barley harvest due to insufficient rain, while another could detail the emergency distribution of grain rations from central storehouses to outlying villages stricken by famine. These were essentially annual reports on the health and vulnerability of their entire ecosystem. This information was absolutely critical for state planning. Royal administrators used these historical records to calculate how much grain needed to be stored in the state granaries as a buffer against future bad years. They could mandate the digging of emergency irrigation canals in regions prone to drought or organize labor forces to reinforce levees in areas susceptible to flooding. The clay tablet transformed from a simple recording device into an early warning system, allowing these societies to move from a reactive posture, simply suffering whatever nature delivered, to a proactive one where they could plan, prepare, and build resilience based on centuries of accumulated ecological knowledge. The true power of this environmental record-keeping, however, may have been realized when it was shared. In a world without satellites or international news agencies, local knowledge was everything. It is not difficult to imagine a scenario where a trading caravan from the north arrived in Babylon with troubling news. Perhaps their own rivers were unusually low, or the snowmelt from the Anatolian mountains had been delayed. This information, passed from merchant to scribe and recorded on a tablet, would have been a priceless piece of intelligence for the Babylonian authorities. A drought beginning in the northern reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates watershed would eventually travel downstream, reaching the heart of Mesopotamia months later. A warning like this could trigger a cascade of preventative actions, rationing water, planting more drought-resistant crops, or negotiating to import extra grain from a neighboring region not yet affected. This represents a profound and early form of international environmental cooperation. While we may not have a specific treaty solely about climate data sharing, the practical exchange of this knowledge through diplomatic and trade channels would have been essential for regional stability. A famine in one kingdom could lead to desperate migrations, raids, and war, destabilizing the entire region. Therefore, sharing data about crop conditions, river levels, and impending shortages was not just an act of charity. It was a strategic necessity for maintaining peace and economic interdependence. These networks of information exchange, etched in clay, wove an ecological safety net that connected distant peoples through a shared interest in surviving the whims of their planet. This ancient struggle to decode and adapt to environmental patterns finds a powerful echo in the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization, a society that flourished over 1,000 miles away. While their script remains undeciphered, the archaeological evidence speaks volumes about their own sophisticated response to environmental challenges. Their greatest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, are marvels of hydraulic engineering, built with intricate networks of covered drains, wells, and large public baths that suggest a deep concern with water management and sanitation. Crucially, many of their settlements show evidence of massive defensive walls not against human armies, but against floodwaters. They were clearly grappling with the same existential threats as the Mesopotamians. The tantalizing possibility exists that somewhere, buried in the ruins of an Indus port city, are clay tablets that recorded tidal patterns of the Arabian Sea, the monsoon schedules, or the silt levels of their rivers. If such records were kept and shared with trading partners in Mesopotamia, and we know there was robust trade between the two regions, it would represent a lost chapter in the history of science, a Bronze Age attempt to create a coordinated understanding of the Indian Ocean's weather systems. Even without deciphered texts, the material evidence shows two great civilizations, entirely independent of one another, arriving at the same conclusion. That meticulous observation and control of the environment was the absolute prerequisite for urban life. The legacy of these ancient environmentalists is far more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting our own contemporary challenges. They understood a fundamental truth that we are now relearning in the face of global climate change. Humanity does not exist apart from its environment, but is deeply and inextricably embedded within it. Their response was to observe, record, and adapt using the best technology available to them, the durable clay tablet, to build a collective memory of the Earth's rhythms. In doing so, they demonstrated that the most vital networks of the ancient world were not just those that carried lapis lazuli and silver, but those that carried crucial information about river heights and rainfall. This was a practical, ecological interdependence that bound the fate of a kingdom on the Tigris to the winter snows in the distant mountains of Anatolia. Their story reminds us that the drive to understand our planet and to work together to navigate its challenges is not a modern innovation, but a very ancient and deeply human imperative, one that was essential for survival then and remains just as critical for our shared future today. When we shift our gaze from the grand narratives of kings and conquests to the intimate details of daily life preserved on these tablets, we uncover a social landscape that often shatters our modern preconceptions about the ancient world. The clay records offer a remarkably nuanced picture of gender dynamics, revealing a spectrum of roles and freedoms for women that varied dramatically across time and culture, directly challenging the simplistic notion of a universally patriarchal past. In the bustling merchant quarters of the Assyrian city of Kanesh, for instance, tablets from a thriving trade colony detail the business dealings of a formidable woman named Ahaha. She was no minor player. The tablets show her independently managing a large commercial enterprise, importing textiles and tin from Assyria, negotiating contracts, and lending significant sums of silver at interest to other merchants, all while corresponding with her husband who managed their affairs back in the capital, Ashur. Her case was not a bizarre anomaly. Legal documents from this period show Assyrian women regularly engaging in business, buying and selling property, serving as witnesses in court, and even initiating divorce proceedings, with clearly defined legal rights to their dowries and inheritances that provided them with economic independence. This economic agency was mirrored in the sacred sphere, where women held positions of immense power and influence. Throughout Mesopotamia, the role of high priestess was one of the most prestigious and politically potent offices a woman could hold. The En or Entu priestess, often a king's daughter, was considered the human spouse of a god. In the city of tablets detail the vast estates and rich resources controlled by the priestesses of the moon god Nana. They were not secluded figures, they were powerful administrators managing large staffs of artisans, farmers, and herders, and their influence often extended into the political and economic life of the entire city-state. Their official correspondence, preserved on clay, shows them negotiating with governors and kings, demonstrating that their authority was both spiritual and tangibly temporal. In other regions, like Anatolia, Hittite tablets describe the queen not merely as the king's consort, but as the Tawananna, a title she held for life, giving her a permanent and powerful role in state religion, diplomacy, and often acting as a co-ruler with significant independent authority. This complex tapestry of social roles was not static or isolated. Just as spices and metals moved along trade routes, so too did ideas about social organization, family structures, and the potential roles of men and women. A merchant traveling from Assyria, where women like Ahaha conducted business, to a port in the Levant, might carry with him not only goods but also a lived example of a different social model. Diplomatic marriages, so crucial for forging alliances, were a particularly potent vector for this kind of cultural exchange. When a princess from Mitanni, accustomed to a certain degree of status and autonomy, married into the Egyptian royal court, she would have been accompanied by a retinue of her own officials, priestesses, and attendants. They brought their customs, their religious practices, and their expectations with them, subtly influencing the courtly culture of their new home. Over time, through these countless personal interactions and observations, perceptions of what was possible or acceptable for each gender could slowly shift and evolve across the interconnected ancient world. The picture that emerges from these countless legal documents, letters, and administrative lists is not one of simple uniformity, but of a vibrant and often surprising diversity. It forces us to abandon a one-dimensional view of history and instead appreciate the intricate and varied ways in which different societies constructed identity, authority, and community. The flow of people and goods along these ancient networks did more than just distribute material wealth. It facilitated a continuous and profound exchange of social ideas, weaving a complex human tapestry where notions of self, family, and power were forever being discussed, adapted, and reimagined under the sun of the ancient world. This meticulous record-keeping and interconnectedness we've been exploring was never just about prosperity. It was also a vital shield against catastrophe. When crisis struck, and in the ancient world it struck with terrifying regularity. The very networks built for trade and diplomacy transformed into emergency lifelines. Clay tablets become our most poignant witnesses to these moments of collective vulnerability, revealing not just the crises themselves, but the sophisticated and often collaborative strategies ancient societies employed to survive them. We move from ledgers of luxury goods to urgent dispatches that speak of famine, disease, and fear, and in doing so, we see the foundational principles of crisis management being written, quite literally, in clay. Consider the Hittite Empire, a formidable power in Anatolia that was perpetually vulnerable to the fluctuations of its highland environment. Tablets from the royal archives at Hattusa provide a masterclass in proactive risk management. They detail the maintenance of a vast state-controlled network of granaries strategically placed across the empire. These were not just seasonal storage pits, they were a calculated national food reserve. Scribes kept meticulous inventories of the grain stocks, noting inflows from taxes and harvests, and outflows for rations and seed for the next planting. This system was designed specifically to weather the inevitable lean years. When cuneiform reports from regional governors began warning of a poor harvest due to drought, the central administration didn't just hope for the best. They could activate a pre-planned response, authorizing the distribution of grain from well-supplied regions to those facing shortage, preventing local famines from escalating into empire-wide destabilization. This was data-driven disaster mitigation on a grand scale, all coordinated through the medium of the clay tablet. But the Hittites' ingenuity didn't stop at their own borders. They understood that even the most well-stocked granaries could be overwhelmed by a prolonged, multi-year catastrophe. This is where their diplomatic networks proved invaluable. We have a remarkable series of letters, a desperate correspondence from the Hittite king Hattusili III to his royal counterpart in Egypt, the pharaoh Merneptah. The subject is not gold or marriage alliances, but food. The letter lays bare a dire situation. "My land is dying," the Hittite king writes, explaining that a severe famine has gripped his kingdom. He then makes a direct and urgent plea. "You must send ships loaded with grain." This was not a request born of mere friendship. It was a strategic appeal between two powers who understood their mutual interdependence. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean with its predictable Nile floods, had a surplus. The Hittites, facing collapse, had a desperate need. The unspoken understanding was that a stable Hittite empire was in Egypt's interest. A weakened or collapsed neighbor could create a power vacuum, unleashing waves of refugees and destabilizing the entire region. The tablet itself is a fossilized moment of ancient international aid, a plea for solidarity that recognized a simple truth. In a connected world, no crisis is ever truly local. This concept of shared vulnerability extended beyond famine to the most terrifying and indiscriminate crisis of all, pandemic disease. While germ theory was millennia away, ancient scribes were astute observers who recorded the horrifying progress of what we now call plagues. Tablets from the Mesopotamian city of Mari describe a devastating illness that swept through the population, causing high fevers and death. The response was a fascinating blend of the practical and the spiritual. Officials implemented what we would recognize as a form of quarantine, isolating the sick and restricting movement between affected cities to slow the spread, a clear understanding that contagion could travel with people. At the same time, priests and healers performed rituals to appease the gods they believed had sent the pestilence. What's crucial is that these reports weren't kept secret. Descriptions of symptoms and the measures taken were shared along diplomatic channels. A king, upon hearing that a trading partner was struck by disease, could preemptively halt travel and prepare his own healers. based on the experiences of others. This early exchange of epidemiological data, however rudimentary, was a form of mutual defense, a way of using their hard-won networks to build an early warning system against invisible invaders. The resilience of these societies was further demonstrated in their response to economic collapse, often triggered by invasion or the sudden disruption of trade routes. We have tablets that act as ancient economic stimulus packages. In the aftermath of a crisis, rulers like the Babylonian king Hammurabi issued edicts known as Mizraim Acts, which were essentially debt amnesties. These decrees, publicly proclaimed and recorded on steels and tablets, cancelled all outstanding personal debts, freed those who had been forced into debt slavery, and returned pledged land to its original owners. This wasn't an act of pure charity. It was a brilliant tool for social and economic recovery. By wiping the financial slate clean for the majority of the population who were subsistence farmers, the king prevented a total societal breakdown. It allowed impoverished families to return to their fields, restart production, and begin contributing to the tax base again, rather than languishing in permanent servitude. This practice recognized that the health of the entire state depended on the economic viability of its smallest units, the individual households, and used the power of the written decree to orchestrate a large-scale reset. The lesson echoing from these ancient tablets is one of profound interdependence. The networks of trade that carried lapis lazuli and tin were the same pathways that carried emergency grain shipments and crucial information about spreading diseases. The diplomatic protocols that facilitated royal marriages were the same channels used to send desperate pleas for help. These civilizations discovered that their greatest asset in the face of existential threats was not just their own stored wealth or strong walls, but their connections to others. They built a form of resilience based on mutual interest and collaborative action, understanding that isolation was a prelude to extinction. In their coordinated responses to famine, plague, and economic shock, we see the deep roots of our modern concepts of international aid, public health policy, and economic recovery programs. Their clay tablets remind us that from the very beginning, human civilization has been a collective project, and our ability to survive the worst that fate can throw at us has always depended on our willingness to reach out, to share, and to support one another across the divides of culture and geography. Perhaps nothing captures the spirit of cultural exchange more vividly than the shared pursuit of beauty. While clay tablets documented the hard realities of commerce and law, they also served as the playbooks for the ancient world's most vibrant artistic collaborations, revealing a landscape where music, poetry, and visual arts flowed as freely as any traded commodity. This was not a secondary effect of trade. It was a primary driver of connection, a way for vastly different peoples to find common ground in shared human expression. Imagine a royal court in the Syrian city of Mari, a bustling hub on the Euphrates River. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the sound of a foreign melody. A group of musicians, perhaps brought as part of a diplomatic envoy from Mesopotamia, performs a hymn to the goddess Ishtar. The local scribes, captivated by the complex rhythms and unfamiliar scales, carefully transcribe the song's lyrics and even its musical notation onto clay tablets, preserving this exotic piece for future performances. These very tablets, unearthed millennia later, provide undeniable proof that artistic tastes were not confined by borders. A hymn composed in a Sumerian temple could become a hit in a Syrian palace, its themes and structures adapted to suit local sensibilities while retaining its distant, foreign soul. This musical exchange was deeply intertwined with the divine and the diplomatic. Music and ritual were inseparable in the ancient world, and the adoption of a foreign hymn often accompanied the adoption of a foreign deity. When a new god was welcomed into a pantheon through trade or treaty, Their entire cultural package arrived with them, their myths, their rituals, and the specific music used to worship them. Tablets from the Hittite capital of Hattusa are particularly revealing in this regard. They contain detailed instructions for religious ceremonies, specifying the exact instruments to be used, lyres, drums, and rattles, and the precise melodies to be played, some of which are explicitly described as being of Hurrian origin. This tells us that Hittite religious music was a deliberate fusion, a curated blend of native and imported sounds designed to honor an international array of gods. The musicians themselves became cultural ambassadors. Skilled singers and instrumentalists were highly prized diplomatic gifts, sent from one court to another to entertain and to demonstrate cultural sophistication. In doing so, they didn't just perform, they taught. They introduced new instruments, new compositional techniques, and new poetic forms, which local musicians would then learn, master, and make their own, creating a beautiful, evolving hybrid that belonged to everyone and no one simultaneously. The same transformative process unfolded in the realm of visual arts and craftsmanship, though here the clay tablets act more as a catalogue than a canvas. We don't find paintings on them, but we find countless descriptions of artworks that were commissioned, traded, and admired. Inventories from palaces and temples list exquisite objects that originated from hundreds of miles away. Intricately carved ivory panels from the Levant depicting sphinxes and griffins, elaborate gold drinking vessels shaped like animal heads from Anatolia, and finely woven textiles with complex patterns from Iran. These were not merely stored as treasure, they were put on display, used in ceremonies, and most importantly, they were copied. A local artisan, seeing a beautifully inlaid Syrian dagger in a noble's possession, might be inspired to incorporate its decorative motifs into his own work, perhaps blending the Syrian style with a traditional local design. Over time, this cross-pollination created distinct regional styles that were themselves amalgamations of influences from across the known world. The iconic Lamashu, the colossal winged bull with a human head that guarded Assyrian palaces, didn't emerge from a vacuum. Its concept borrows from earlier Mesopotamian protective deities, but its specific, powerful form shows clear influences from the artistic traditions of the Hurrians and other northern cultures with whom the Assyrians had extensive contact. This statue, meant to project pure Assyrian power, was itself the product of artistic globalization. Perhaps the most profound artistic exchange, however, was literary. We've already seen how epic narratives like Gilgamesh traveled, but the exchange of poetic forms and metaphors was equally significant. The passionate, intimate language of Sumerian love poetry, which expressed devotion to both human lovers and divine figures, seems to have deeply influenced the development of similar poetic traditions in neighboring cultures. The way a Babylonian poet described the longing for a distant god could resonate with an Egyptian scribe crafting a hymn to Osiris, not because one copied the other, but because the emotional vocabulary had been expanded and enriched through exposure. This shared pool of metaphors and imagery, comparing a ruler to a strong bull, a goddess to the morning star, or love to a sweet, intoxicating wine, created a common artistic language. It meant that a skilled court poet, trained in the literary traditions of his own city, could also appreciate and understand the aesthetic achievements of a foreign culture. This fostered a deep, empathetic appreciation that went beyond politics or economics. It was a recognition of shared creativity, an acknowledgement that beauty, in all its forms, was a universal human value worth celebrating and exchanging. In a world often divided by language and custom, art became the ultimate translator, conveying meaning and emotion where words alone might fail, building bridges of understanding that made the ancient world feel just a little bit smaller and a little more connected. Now, let's listen closely to the voices preserved in these tablets, not just for the stories they tell, but for the very sound and structure of the words themselves, because the clay captures a world in constant linguistic motion. These aren't static monuments to a single language, they are dynamic records of a bustling Babel, showing us how languages evolved, merged, and borrowed from one another in real time, all facilitated by the interconnected networks we've been exploring. The most powerful example of this is the rise of Akkadian. It began as the native tongue of the Akkadians, a Semitic people who rose to power in Mesopotamia under Sargon the Great around 2300 BC. But after the Akkadian Empire faded, its language did not disappear. Instead, it performed an incredible feat of reverse conquest. For the next 2,000 years, Akkadian, written in the adapted Cuneiform script, became the undisputed lingua franca of the entire Near East, the essential language of diplomacy, trade, and high culture from the coasts of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Iran. This was the ancient equivalent of English today, a language that everyone in international circles needed to know, regardless of their native tongue. The Amarna letters, that treasure trove of diplomatic correspondence from Egypt, are the ultimate proof. Here are pharaohs of Egypt, the most powerful rulers in the region, conducting their state business not in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in Akkadian cuneiform, writing to their counterparts in Anatolia and Babylon in this adopted linguistic medium. This wasn't about cultural submission, it was about pragmatic necessity. Using a common language reduced the immense risk of misunderstanding in sensitive negotiations over alliances, borders, and royal marriages. The tablets themselves are filled with charming evidence of this linguistic melting pot, showing how scribes from different regions wrestled with this foreign tongue. We find letters from Canaanite rulers, for instance, whose command of Akkadian is creative, to say the least. Their tablets are peppered with Canaanite words and grammatical structures awkwardly shoehorned into Akkadian sentences, creating a unique hybrid dialect that linguists can now identify as Canaanite Akkadian. It's the ancient version of someone using Google Translate. The core meaning is there, but the local flavor is unmistakable. Even more fascinating are the glosses, little notes scribbled in the margins of tablets. A scribe might write a complex Akkadian word and then immediately jot its translation in his native Hittite or Hurrian above it, a tiny cheat sheet for himself or for the reader. These personal annotations are like eavesdropping on an ancient language learner struggling with vocabulary. But beyond these errors and notes, we see a more profound and deliberate blending. Scribes began adopting foreign words for which there was no easy local equivalent. The Sumerian word for a specific type of priest, En, was borrowed directly into Akkadian, Hittite, and other languages because the role was so uniquely Mesopotamian. Similarly, the Hittites adopted the Hurrian word for a specific type of ritual bread because the concept arrived with the Hurrian religious practices themselves. This wasn't just borrowing, it was a purposeful enrichment of their own languages, a way to capture new concepts and technologies that arrived from abroad. This constant linguistic exchange did more than just build vocabulary. It began to shape the very grammars of these languages in subtle ways. The prolonged contact between Akkadian and the older Sumerian language, for instance, left deep marks. Even after Sumerian died out as a spoken language, remaining only as a classical tongue for scholars and priests, much like Latin in medieval Europe, its influence persisted. Akkadian legal and administrative documents continued to be filled with Sumerian loanwords and formulaic phrases, a sign of respect for tradition and the immense cultural prestige of Sumerian civilization. In other regions, the structure of sentences might slowly shift to align more closely with a dominant trading partner's patterns. making communication smoother and more intuitive. This process of convergence meant that even though a Hittite and an Assyrian merchant might be speaking Akkadian, the shadow of their native languages would subtly influence their speech, creating a kind of middle ground dialect that was optimized for mutual understanding. This overcoming of communication barriers was absolutely fundamental. It paved the way for everything from complex multi-party trade agreements to the intricate diplomatic protocols we saw earlier. It allowed for the precise translation of technical manuals for metalworking, the accurate transmission of medical prescriptions, and the faithful recording of astronomical data. By providing a common linguistic framework, this evolving, hybrid Akkadian became the software that ran the hardware of ancient globalization, enabling a depth of cooperation and exchange that would have been impossible in a world fractured by 1,000 mutually unintelligible tongues. For all our theorizing about ancient connections, nothing makes the past feel real quite like the moment a shovel strikes something solid, and a piece of that hidden world is suddenly brought back into the light. The true revolution in our understanding of these global networks hasn't come from reinterpreting old books, but from the ground itself, from the breathtaking archaeological discoveries that have given us the very documents we've been discussing. These aren't just random finds, they are time capsules deliberately buried by collapse and conquest, waiting for centuries to deliver their messages. Perhaps no single discovery has been more monumental than the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Imagine the scene in the 1850s as excavators like Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam tunneled into the great mounds of Iraq. They weren't just finding broken pottery or crumbling walls. They were breaking into a room that hadn't been entered for 2,500 years, a room whose floors were literally carpeted with clay tablets. This was no ordinary archive. It was the obsessive collection of a king who proudly declared his literacy and his hunger for knowledge. His agents had scoured the ancient world, from Babylon to distant provinces, collecting, copying, and preserving the entire intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia. Here, in one place, were the creation epic Enuma Elish, the wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh in its most complete form, along with thousands of texts on medicine, astronomy, omens, and administration. This one library provided the core texts that allowed scholars to finally read the literature of this lost world, not just its receipts. It proved that the Assyrians, so often depicted as brutal conquerors, were also passionate preservers of knowledge, and that this knowledge was considered a prize of empire as valuable as any gold or timber. Then, just over a century later, another discovery would send even greater shockwaves through the academic world, completely rewriting the map of the ancient Near East. In 1974, an Italian archaeologist named Paolo Mattei was excavating a large mound in northern Syria known as Tel Marduk. His team unearthed a statue with an inscription that allowed them to identify the site. This was the lost city of Ebla. The real astonishment came when they discovered the palace archives, a collection of nearly 20,000 tablets, many of them perfectly preserved because they were baked hard in the fire that destroyed the palace around 2300 BCE. When scholars began to decipher them, they realized these weren't written in Akkadian or Sumerian, but in a previously unknown Semitic language now called Eblate. The contents were staggering. Here were the administrative records of a powerful, sophisticated kingdom that no one knew existed, a major player in the 3rd millennium BC that controlled vast trade networks. Their economic texts mentioned familiar places like Byblos on the Mediterranean coast and distant powers like Mari on the Euphrates, but they also contained a bombshell, references to places like Hazor and Gaza in Canaan, and even to Sodom and Gomorrah, suggesting the historical geography of the Bible had roots stretching back centuries earlier than anyone imagined. The Ebla tablets revealed a dense network of diplomatic and commercial interactions spanning the Levant, proving that complex international relations were flourishing 1,000 years before the Amarna letters. It was a humbling reminder that history is full of forgotten empires and that a single discovery can force us to tear up our old textbooks and start again. The thrill of these finds isn't just in the libraries of kings. It's also in the records of everyday people found in the most unexpected places. Take the ancient merchant colony of Kultep in Turkey, known in antiquity as Kanish. Here, archaeologists uncovered the archives of Assyrian merchants who had set up a trading post far from home. These tablets weren't stored in a palace. They were in the private houses of these businessmen, detailing their transactions, their disputes with local authorities, their letters home to their wives in Ashur, and their worries about profits and caravans. They give us a street-level view of globalization, from the cost of renting a donkey to the emotional toll of being a long-distance trader. Similarly, the discovery of cuneiform tablets at Tel Hazer in Israel, and even fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh at Megiddo, prove that the cultural influence of Mesopotamia penetrated deep into the Levant. These weren't official diplomatic documents. They were likely used for education, showing that Canaanite scribes were learning their craft by copying classic Mesopotamian literature. Every one of these finds, from a king's vast library to a merchant's humble ledger, acts like a pin on a map, drawing a line of connection between two places we previously thought were separate. They provide the tangible, irrefutable proof that theories of ancient trade routes and cultural exchange are not just academic speculation, they are physical reality, waiting in the soil for us to find. Each tablet is a node in that vast, ancient network, and with every new excavation, we plug another one in, watching as the lights of the past blink on one by one, revealing a world that was far more brilliant and interconnected than we ever dared to dream. For centuries, the painstaking work of deciphering these clay tablets relied on little more than a magnifying glass, a sharp eye, and the brilliant intuition of scholars like Rawlinson and Ventris. It was a slow, arduous process, often limited by the physical fragility of the tablets themselves. Many were broken into fragments, their pieces scattered across different museums and collections around the world. Others were so badly fired, damaged, or eroded that their inscriptions were nearly invisible to the naked eye. But today, we are in the midst of a technological revolution that is fundamentally transforming this field, not by replacing the human scholar, but by giving them superhuman tools to see the unseeable and reassemble the irreparable. At the forefront of this change is three-dimensional scanning. Imagine a laser scanner gently passing over the surface of a cracked tablet, capturing every single minute indentation and curvature with micron-level precision. This creates an incredibly detailed digital model that can be manipulated on a screen. Researchers can then use virtual light sources, angling them from different directions to cast shadows across the tiny wedges of cuneiform, making faint markings suddenly leap into clear view. They can even digitally flatten curved or warped tablets, making the text far easier to read without ever applying a drop of moisture or an ounce of physical pressure to the original artifact. This non-invasive analysis is a game-changer, allowing us to extract new information from tablets that have been studied for over a century, revealing lines of text that were previously completely hidden. Perhaps the most exciting application of this technology is in the digital reconstruction of broken tablets. For decades, a fragment of a tablet in the British Museum might have been separated from its other half, which was sitting in a museum in Istanbul, with no one ever realizing they were part of the same object. Now, teams are creating vast digital libraries of 3D scans of all known tablet fragments. Powerful algorithms can then scour these databases, comparing the breakage patterns, the curvature of the edges, and the handwriting on thousands of fragments in a matter of seconds, something a human could never hope to do in a lifetime. There have already been stunning successes where fragments from different continents have been digitally rejoined, like solving the world's oldest and most meaningful jigsaw puzzle. A complete tablet is infinitely more valuable than the sum of its parts, as it restores a full narrative, a complete legal document, or an entire administrative record, giving us a whole new text to study and understand. This is where artificial intelligence enters the picture, acting as the ultimate pattern recognition partner for linguists and historians. AI systems can be trained on thousands of already translated cuneiform signs. Once trained, they can rip through newly digitized tablets at an astonishing rate, suggesting probable translations for words or phrases and identifying grammatical structures. But their true power lies in spotting subtle, large-scale patterns that are almost impossible for a human to detect across a corpus of tens of thousands of texts. For instance, an eye analyzing the vast merchant archives from Assyria might notice that every time a specific rare word appears in a contract, it is almost always followed by a shipment being delayed by 2 months. This could lead a historian to realize that word refers to a specific seasonal weather pattern in the Taurus Mountains that halted travel. In this way, AI doesn't provide the answers. It provides the incredibly smart, data-driven questions that can guide researchers toward new breakthroughs. It can map the evolution of a specific cuneiform sign over centuries with perfect accuracy, or identify the unique stylistic fingerprint of a specific scribe who worked in a particular city, allowing us to trace the movement of these literate individuals across the ancient world. This modern renaissance is fueled by a beautiful collaboration that bridges the deepest past with the most cutting-edge present. It's no longer just archaeologists and philologists working in isolation. Now, the team includes computer scientists, data analysts, and software engineers. They speak different professional languages. One group debates the nuances of Akkadian verb forms, while the other optimizes machine learning algorithms. But together, they are creating a new discipline, a fusion of ancient history and digital humanities that is breaking down barriers at an unprecedented pace. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative are making high-quality images and scans of tablets freely available online to anyone in the world, democratizing access to this priceless cultural heritage and inviting bright minds from every field to contribute to the work of decoding. This collaborative spirit ensures that the quest for lost knowledge is more alive and more promising than ever before. Every new algorithm, every more powerful scanner, brings us closer to hearing the full, uninterrupted chorus of voices from the ancient world, reminding us that their stories are not finished being told. But what does this vast web of interconnection truly signify? Was it merely a series of random exchanges, or something far more profound, a blueprint for the modern world, etched in clay thousands of years before our own era of globalization? This is the compelling question posed by historians and archaeologists like Andrew Sherratt and Jared Diamond, who argue that these ancient networks were not just precursors to our globalized age, they were a form of globalization itself. Sherratt's concept of a Bronze Age world system is particularly powerful. He didn't see these civilizations as isolated islands of development, but as nodes in a single, sprawling network where the core regions of Mesopotamia and Egypt were connected to peripheries stretching from Britain to the Indus Valley. In this system, the flow of goods was never just about the objects themselves. That tin traveling from Afghanistan to a workshop in Anatolia wasn't just a commodity. It was a carrier of ideas, a catalyst for technological change, and a thread pulling distant peoples into a shared economic and cultural orbit. The movement of precious materials created interlocking dependencies, where the fate of a kingdom could hinge on the stability of a trade route 1,000 miles away. This was a world already grappling with the core dynamics of globalization, immense wealth generated through long-distance exchange, but also a vulnerability to disruptions far beyond any local leader's control. Jared Diamond, in his sweeping work, offers a complementary but distinct lens, focusing on the environmental and geographical foundations that made this connectedness possible. His theory doesn't center on human genius alone, but on the raw materials that genius had to work with, the fortunate accident of Eurasia's east-west axis. Unlike the north-south orientations of the Americas and Africa, which present migrating peoples and domesticating crops with drastic changes in climate and day length, Eurasia's vast expanse lies largely along similar latitudes. This meant that crops like wheat and barley, first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, could spread with relative ease across the continent, from the fields of Mesopotamia to the plains of Europe and the valleys of the Indus. The same was true for technological innovations. The wheel, once invented, could roll across landscapes that were broadly similar, its usefulness understood and adopted by culture after culture without having to be reinvented each time. This geographical luck, Diamond argues, provided the essential groundwork for the rapid and sustained transmission of what he calls human cargoes, not just goods, but the game-changing ideas of writing, statecraft, and metallurgy. The clay tablets are the ultimate proof of this, showing how a system of record-keeping born between the Tigris and Euphrates became the administrative backbone for empires across the ancient world. This ancient globalization, however, was a double-edged sword, delivering profound progress alongside deeply entrenched problems. The acceleration of cultural and technological development was undeniable. A breakthrough in alloying bronze in one region could revolutionize weaponry and tools across 3 continents within a few generations. A mathematical concept discovered in Babylon could later inform engineering projects in Egypt. This rapid cross-pollination of ideas created a collective acceleration of human capability that would have been impossible for any isolated society to achieve on its own. But this very connectedness also facilitated the spread of humanity's greatest scourges. The same trade routes that carried lapis lazuli and textiles also provided a highway for deadly pathogens. Dense urban centers, connected by constant traffic, became perfect incubators for diseases to which populations had no prior immunity. There is compelling skeletal evidence and textual hints of devastating plagues sweeping through the ancient Near East, likely the first terrible pandemics in human history, made possible by the very networks that also brought prosperity. Furthermore, these networks didn't create a flat, equal world. They actively forged the world's first major inequalities. The core regions that controlled the trade, like Mesopotamia and Egypt, accumulated immense wealth and power, often at the expense of the peripheral regions that supplied the raw materials. We see this in the archaeological record. The staggering luxury of royal tombs in Ur, filled with gold and lapis lazuli from distant lands, stands in stark contrast to the simpler burials in the regions that mined those materials. This economic disparity frequently bred resentment and conflict. The Amarna letters are filled with accusations of unfair treatment and threats from smaller powers feeling exploited. The relentless demand for resources like timber, copper, and tin drove imperial expansion and warfare, as powerful states sought to secure these vital commodities by force, subjugating their neighbors. The interconnected world of the Bronze Age, therefore, was not a peaceful global village. It was a competitive, often violent arena where cooperation and conflict were two sides of the same coin, a dynamic that feels all too familiar in our own globalized era. It's almost breathtaking to realize how deeply our modern world is mirrored in these ancient slabs of clay. We often think of globalization as a uniquely contemporary phenomenon, born from jet engines, fiber optic cables, and the internet. But the clay tablets reveal a startling truth. We are not pioneers of a connected world. We are inheritors of a system that is thousands of years old, grappling with the same fundamental opportunities and challenges that have always accompanied human interconnection. The Assyrian merchant complaining about the quality of his copper in a letter to his business partner is the direct ancestor of today's international executive sending a frustrated email about a delayed shipment. The diplomatic protocols of the Amarna letters, with their elaborate flattery and careful negotiation, are the ancient blueprint for the summits and treaties that shape our geopolitics today. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a powerful lens through which to examine our own era, offering both cautionary tales and enduring wisdom for building a global system that is not only efficient but also equitable and resilient. Consider our digital revolution. We pride ourselves on living in the information age, but the ancient Mesopotamians were the original information architects. Their clay tablets were the hard drives of their day, and the scribes were their data analysts. The meticulous record-keeping that managed the grain stores of or the labor forces of the Hittite Empire is the direct precursor to our own vast systems of big data, supply chain management, and digital bureaucracy. They understood that to manage complexity, you must first measure it, and to ensure fairness, you must first record it. Their relentless drive to inscribe every transaction, every law, and every astronomical observation onto a permanent medium was born from the same impulse that now leads us to store our lives in the cloud. The medium has changed from fired clay to silicon, but the human goal remains identical: to create a lasting, verifiable record that builds trust, enables administration, and preserves knowledge across generations. This historical context should humble us. Our obsession with data is not new. It is a very ancient and profoundly human response to the complexities of organized society. Yet the ancient world also offers us a stark warning about the fragility of these systems. The very networks that brought immense wealth and cultural richness to the Bronze Age also created a world of intense interdependence, where a crisis in one corner could trigger a collapse across continents. Historians now believe that a perfect storm of factors, including climate change, famine, earthquakes, and the sudden disruption of those carefully maintained trade routes, likely contributed to the catastrophic collapse of numerous civilizations around 1200 BC. The palaces burned, the writing systems were forgotten, and a dark age descended. This is perhaps the most profound lesson for our own interconnected planet. Our just-in-time supply chains, our globally integrated financial markets, and our reliance on digital infrastructure have created a world of breathtaking efficiency, but also breathtaking vulnerability. A pandemic, a volcanic eruption that disrupts air travel, or a cyber attack on a critical hub can send shockwaves through the entire global system, just as a drought in Anatolia could once starve cities in Mesopotamia. The clay tablets remind us that globalization has always been a double-edged sword, creating both immense resilience through diversity and shared resources, and immense risk through shared vulnerability. This brings us to the most critical lesson etched into these ancient records: the irreplaceable value of cultural empathy and diplomatic dialogue. The ancient world was not a peaceful utopia. It was often brutal and dominated by military power. But the tablets show us that the most successful and enduring states were those that invested not just in armies, but in diplomacy, in understanding foreign customs, and in building bridges through marriage, gift exchange, and the respectful adoption of foreign gods, a practice known as syncretism. The Hittite practice of incorporating the deities of conquered peoples into their own pantheon was a brilliant strategy of inclusion, a way of saying, "Your gods are welcome here." This ancient form of multiculturalism fostered stability and loyalty across a diverse empire. In our own time of resurgent nationalism and cultural tension, this is a powerful reminder. The clay tablets prove that humanity has always thrived not through isolation and purity, but through contact, exchange, and the courageous, often messy, work of finding common ground with those who are different from us. Our modern concepts of international law, cultural exchange programs, and diplomatic immunity are not weak alternatives to power. They are the evolved, hard-won tools for managing the complex reality of a connected world, and they have deep, deep roots. Ultimately, these silent witnesses from the past speak to something fundamental and enduring in the human spirit, an insatiable drive to reach out, to connect, to trade, and to understand. The merchant who braved bandits and deserts to bring lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia was driven by the same spirit of enterprise and curiosity that fuels a startup founder in Silicon Valley today. The scribe who carefully copied a medical text from a distant land, hoping to save lives in his own community, was participating in the same collective project of shared human knowledge that now sees scientists from around the world collaborating on a vaccine. The clay tablets show us that our current global community, for all its technological sophistication, is not a historical anomaly. It is the latest chapter in a story that began 5,000 years ago when the first scribe pressed a reed into wet clay to record a deal with someone from a distant city. They remind us that our urge to connect and collaborate is our greatest inheritance, and that by looking back at these first experiments in globalization, we can find both inspiration and guidance for building a future that is more connected, more understanding, and more humane. As we've journeyed through the lost knowledge preserved in clay tablets, it's clear that these ancient artifacts reveal a world far more connected and sophisticated than we often imagine. From trade and diplomacy to science and art, these tablets show that human civilizations have always thrived on interaction and shared learning. Let this exploration inspire you to look at history not as isolated events, but as a web of relationships that shaped our world. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What ancient mystery should we uncover next? Together, let's keep unraveling the threads of our